Who gets to reopen the past? Canada calls truth-telling as healing. But when Indians speak about the colonial violence, we are told to simply move on. Why the double standards? And why am I starting my entire podcast here? Well, like Simon Sinek says, we have to start with the why. And my why is simple. The stories that we are allowed to tell shape the futures we are allowed to imagine. You see, there's a kind of history that refuses to die. You can ban the language, you can burn the libraries, you can rename the streets, but the story still throbs in the hearts of the songs, the chants of the mantras, and in the way we pause to thank the very ground we walk on. Good day, namaste. You're listening to the Mitra Desai Show. And this is our very first episode. I'm your friend and host, Mitra, and on this show, we follow the traces of civilizations that have survived erasure and kept remaking themselves, from Bharat to Australia and beyond. If we're starting a new journey together, we have to start with the why. Why begin this podcast? Why talk about truth-telling? So I want to look at that particular question from the lens of who gets permission to reopen the past and who is expected to stay silent about it. Let me offer three possibilities. First, globally, we are in a truth-telling moment. From Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission on residential schools to Australia's Bringing Them Home report, and even the state of Victoria's Yoorrook Justice Commission. Countries are experimenting with formal ways of saying, let the record show what was done and to whom. Now, if we don't place Bharat inside that global conversation, the story of colonialism gets told about us, but not by us. Secondly, the silence is not neutral at all. Now, when former imperial countries, they televise the darkest chapters, we congratulate them. We call them healing or facing history. But when Indians talk about whether it's the Bengal famine or the loot, the classrooms have taught us to be embarrassed, and the tone suddenly shifts to wallowing or victim mindset or move on. Now, it's the same action. We're talking about the harm that was done, but it's given opposite moral labels, depending on who's speaking. So starting this podcast here is my way of saying that our truth deserves the same moral status. And thirdly, I'm sharing these stories now because we are living through a struggle over memory. Algorithms and textbooks are deciding quietly what counts as too negative to be taught. So if we don't speak now, future generations will inherit a curated amnesia. So I don't want my son or my nephews and nieces to learn more about someone else's genocide than know about what happened to their own ancestors. So today, this is the very first episode of the Mitra Desai Show. And I want to sit with one question. Who gets permission to reopen the past? And who is expected to stay silent? Stick with me because the examples will surprise you. Now, if you've been anywhere near my social media lately, you've probably seen some version of the same three lines under my work. Why dig up the past? On surface, these sound grounded, even practical. They're coming from people who are dealing with day-to-day challenges in life, the relentless problems of the present. So now, when you're in survival mode, anything that sounds like a history lesson can feel like a luxury. Before we go any further, I want to define what I mean by truth-telling. And also remind us that as a concept, this is not new to Bharat at all. So in transitional justice, truth-telling is not just talking about history. It's actually a structured process that does four things. It exposes the denied or distorted truths. It centers the voices of those who have suffered. It names who was responsible and how those structures may still persist. And it builds a record that future generations cannot easily deny what happened. So you see, this is not like a therapy circle for the nation's conscience. It's actually an archive of accountability. Internationally, truth telling is recognized as one pillar of transitional justice. It sits alongside prosecutions, reparations, and institutional reforms. Now, without that one pillar, every other reform or apology can look like a PR stunt or even payout that looks like hush money. But if you grew up in Bharat or with Bharatiya values, you already know the deeper roots of this idea. So, this is not really a new idea. Satyam Vada, speak the truth, Dharmam Chara, walk in Dharma, from the Taittiriya Upanishad, or Satyameva Jayate, truth alone triumphs, from the Mundak Upanishad. These are not just mottos that you see on government emblems. They ended up there because they are civilizational commitments to truth as the basis of right action. So the concept of truth telling is not new to India or Bharat at all. What is new, however, and possibly underdeveloped, is its modern application. In plain language, truth telling simply means this is how the society stops lying to itself. And that's the lens I'm carrying when I look at Canada's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or Australia's Bringing Them Home report, or Victoria's Yoorrook Commission report. Now, you see, the move on chorus tends to come from two directions: non Indians or colonial apologists. Now, these are people often from former imperial countries who feel personally attacked when anyone questions the British Empire's civilizing mission. They tend to say, you are just bitter. The British gave you railways, they gave you everything. This group does not want truth telling because it complicates the self image they have inherited. Truth makes them uncomfortable. But the second set are Indians themselves, possibly exhausted by the everyday challenges or even frustrated with endless negativity, or genuinely convinced that constantly revisiting the pain keeps the wound open instead of letting us heal. Some may even be from the generations who have survived partition, emergency, economic collapse, and after all the calamities, they have built something anyway. So their move on comes from the survival instinct, not denial. Now, I don't dismiss either groups lightly. In fact, I don't dismiss them at all. But I do notice that the same people who say move on to Indians rarely say that when Canada holds a truth commission or when Australia holds a royal commission on child abuse. So let's look at these concrete examples to understand what I really mean. Canada ran residential schools from the 1880s until the 1990s. Now, these were church run, state funded institutions designed to kill the Indian in the child. Indigenous children were taken from their families. They were forbidden to speak in their languages. They were punished for practicing their cultures and subjected to physical, sexual, and psychological abuse. Thousands died. Thousands more came out severed from their identity. In 2008, after decades of advocacy by the survivors, Canada launched the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, or TRC. It ran for several years. It held hearings across the country and it heard testimonies from more than 6,000 former students and their families. It released a final report with 94 calls to action, concrete steps to reform welfare, education, justice, health, and commemoration. So here's what changed. The Commission officially described the residential school system as a form of cultural genocide. That language matters because it was not unfortunate policy or a well-intentioned mistake. It's genocide aimed at destroying indigenous peoples as distinct cultural groups. So that word then enters the public record, the classroom, the museums. The churches issued formal apologies, and the federal government created a national day for truth and reconciliation. Survivors were given space to speak on national platforms, in archives, and in educational material. Did it fix everything? No. Indigenous communities in Canada still face poverty, over-incarceration, missing and murdered women and girls, and ongoing land disposition. But what the TRC did was this. It made denial harder. It created a record that future generations cannot easily erase. It shifted part of the national conversation from get over it to how do we actually repair this? That is what truth telling does. It does not replace justice, it just makes justice possible by making the truth undeniable. Now, Australia also did something similar with the stolen generations. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander children were forcibly removed from their families between roughly 1910 and 1970. They were placed in institutions or they were adopted into white families to breed out their indigeneity. In 1997, after a national inquiry, Australia released Bringing Them Home report. Now, this report documented the trauma. It gathered testimonies and made 54 recommendations across apologies, reparations, family unions, records access, and so much more. The report concluded that the policy of child removal involved systematic racial discrimination and amounted to genocide under the UN Genocide Convention. It called for a national apology, compensation, family tracing, and reunification support, and even truth telling in schools. Eventually, in 2008, then Prime Minister Kevin Rudd issued a formal apology in Parliament. This was televised nationwide with survivors present, a landmark moment that entered the country's shared memory. More recently, the state of Victoria launched the Yoorrook Justice Commission in 2021, Australia's first formal truth-telling process into colonization. Now, this commission has the powers of a royal commission, including the ability to compel documents and testimony. It has investigated land disposition, frontier violence, child removal, and systematic discrimination. Its final reports are intended to guide the treaty negotiations between the First Peoples Assembly and the state. Again, not perfect, not complete, but a public, formal, state-backed process that says, we will investigate what was done. We will look into who did it and how to repair it. That's truth-telling with a bite. Now, let's talk about India. It has already been 75 years since independence. India largely chose a path that focused on building forward, nation building, planning, and holding a fragile country together, without creating the kind of truth commissions that Canada and Australia later pursued for the colonial harms. So 75 years later, there has been no national system to systematically gather testimonies and trace the full impact of multiple colonizations. And there has been no commission gathering survivor testimony about the Bengal famine or indentured labor or about deindustrialization or about the destruction of our education systems, the very systems that valued indigenous knowledge. There has been no formal archive of voices saying, this is what happened to my family, this is what happened to my ancestors, or this is what was lost. Yes, we have scattered efforts, some in books, some in speeches. We have economic research on the colonial drain of wealth. And we even have oral histories, but they are passed down primarily in families. So no, we don't have a safe space to talk about all of these things or a legally mandated process which says, let the record show what happened and let us build policy to that truth. Now, this silence has consequences. It means many Indians were never clearly told, whether it's in school, in public discourse, or in literature, the full scope of what happened to us. Therefore, it remains ambiguous. So when someone says, oh, but the British gave you the railways, there is no widely known counter archive to say otherwise. So anytime someone says that they used the same rail network to transport and export grains out of India while contributing to millions of famine deaths, it seems like outrage farming. So the silence has made the denial easier. But here's what changes when a society formally tells the truth. The very first outcome is that denial becomes harder, practically impossible. When the Canadian TRC called the residential schools a form of cultural genocide, that language entered textbooks, museums, and public memory. You can't easily say it wasn't that bad. When survivors testified on national platforms and the state said, yes, it was bad. Second, apologies and any accountability gain real weight. So, in the Canadian and the Australian context, the perpetrators and the victim lines, while still contested, they were now clearer. Settler states facing their treatment of Indigenous peoples. That line was very clear. In India, the conundrum is different. The primary perpetrators of colonial violence was an empire headquartered elsewhere. Who apologizes? On whose behalf? And how do we deal with collaborators and internal oppression layered on top of the external rule? I'm raising this as a question not because there's an easy answer, but to say that India's situation is structurally very different from the classic settler state models. Now, third is repair becomes possible. The Australian Yoorrook Commission's findings are designed to inform treaty negotiations here in Victoria. The TRC's 94 calls to action offer a roadmap for reform in child welfare, education, language, health, and even justice. You see, you can't really repair what you haven't named. Fourth is that future generations, they inherit a record, not just a rumor. So when someone asks, what did colonization do to you? I don't want to hand them a blog post or a viral reel. I want to hand them a formal, recognized archive which says, here is what happened. Here is who said so, and here is what we are doing about it. So truth-telling does not replace reparations or restorations, but it makes all of those things harder to deny and easier to demand. You see, it shifts the burden of proof away from the harmed to the documented record. None of the examples that we've looked at in this episode talked about moving on just by looking away. In fact, they stopped. They turned around and said, let the record show. So in my view, that's really not wallowing. That's not bitterness. That's actually the work that is required to make denial impossible. So if Canada and Australia, countries that benefited from the empire, can do that work, why can India not look at it from this lens? I'm not saying we need to copy their models, because India's history is different. Our wounds are different. Our philosophical toolkit is also different. We come from a civilization that has long said, Satyam vada dharmam chara and Satyameva jayate. Yet, we have not fully translated those principles into a modern collective process. But the principle stands. Truth-telling is not the opposite of moving forward. It is the very foundation of it, because you cannot heal what you won't name, and you cannot build a future on a lie. That is why this is the very first episode of the Mitra Desai Show. Before we talk about how civilizations survive erasure, we have to agree that naming erasure is not a moral failure. It is the starting point. So if you've listened this far, I want to hear from you. Did you know about these truth-telling processes in Canada and Australia? If this is new to you, if you're shocked, surprised, or if this stirred something from your own family history, leave me a comment. This is just the beginning of the Mitra Desai Show. If you want to keep uncovering these unerasable truths with me, please subscribe to this podcast on your platform of choice, whether that's YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcast, or anywhere else that you listen. I'll leave all the links in the description. That's it for this time. Thank you for listening. I'll see you in the next one.